An employee delays a major product launch. Her supervisor says she is indecisive. She says the deadline was impossible. The technical team blames a broken approval system. The quality control team says the delay prevented a defective product from reaching customers. Same event, but four very different explanations of why it happened. One explanation centers the person. Another centers the circumstances. Another centers the process. And another centers the goal. What changed was not necessarily the event itself. What changed was the grammar used to explain its motive. Kenneth Burke created a 5-part framework for exposing that grammar. The dramatistic Pentad. This is reclaiming rhetoric. Today we are breaking down Kenneth Burke's Pentad, a framework for understanding how people explain actions, assign motives, distribute responsibility, and make behavior appear reasonable or unreasonable. Burke introduced the Pentad in A Grammar of Motives, first published in 1945. His approach, which he called dramatism, examines human symbolic action through 5 terms: act, scene, agent, agency, and purpose. Together they answer 5 basic questions. What happened? Where or under what circumstances? Who did it? By what means? And toward what end? But the Pentad is not simply another version of who, what, when, where, and why. Its real power appears when we examine how those 5 terms interact. Start with the act. The act is what happened, in thought or deed. In our example, the company delayed the product launch. That sounds straightforward, but even that description involves a choice. Was the launch delayed? Was it postponed? Was it stopped? Was it protected from a premature release? Those descriptions point toward the same general event, but they do not interpret it in the same way. Even identifying the act can shape how the event is understood. Next is the scene. The scene is the background or situation in which the act occurred. Maybe the team was understaffed. Maybe the requirements kept changing. Maybe the deadline had been set months earlier. Maybe the testing software was unstable. Maybe new regulations appeared shortly before launch. Scene is larger than physical location. It can expand from a meeting room to a company culture, an industry, an economy, or even an entire historical period. Burke described this changing scope as the scene's circumference. Widen the circumference, and the action may start to look less like one person's decision and more like the result of a larger environment. Narrow it, and individual responsibility may appear stronger. Then comes the agent. The agent is the person, group, or kind of person who performed the act. Was the agent one project manager? The development team? Senior leadership? The company itself? That choice matters. A description centered on the agent invites questions about character, judgment, competence, and responsibility. If the project manager becomes the agent, we may ask whether she made a poor decision. If the company becomes the agent, we may start examining institutional priorities instead. Agency answers a different question. How was the act carried out? Agency refers to the methods, tools, systems, or instruments through which someone acts. In this example, agency might include the testing process, the project management software, the approval chain, or the internal communication system. Agency is not the person acting. It is what the person or organization acts through. That distinction matters because a story about a failed employee and a story about a failed system distribute responsibility very differently. The 5th term is purpose. Purpose asks toward what end the action was performed. Perhaps the team delayed the launch to prevent customers from receiving a defective product. Perhaps leadership wanted to avoid legal risk. Perhaps the manager simply wanted more time. Purpose identifies what the action was meant to achieve. But purpose should not be treated as a synonym for motive itself. In Burke's framework, motive emerges from the relationships among all 5 terms, not from the purpose box alone. And that brings us to the part of the Pentad that actually makes it useful. If you stop after identifying act, scene, agent, agency, and purpose, you have described the event. You have not yet analysed the rhetoric. Burke called the relationships among the terms ratios. A ratio asks how one element helps explain another. Different ratios produce different accounts of motive. Take the agent-act ratio. The manager delayed the launch because she is indecisive. The agent explains the act. The event becomes evidence about the manager's character. The delay is interpreted as something that happened because of who she is. Now shift to the scene-act ratio. The launch was delayed because the team was understaffed and the requirements kept changing. Now the scene explains the act. The same delay starts looking less like a personal failure and more like a response to difficult circumstances. Or consider the agency-act ratio. The launch was delayed because the approval system and testing process failed. Now the means explain the act. Responsibility moves away from one person and toward the system through which the work was performed. Then there is the purpose-act ratio. The team delayed the launch to prevent a defective product from reaching customers. Now purpose explains the act. What initially looked like failure can begin to look like caution, responsibility, or even good judgment. The launch has not changed. The delay has not changed. But the motive, moral meaning, and distribution of blame have. This is why a pentadic analysis asks which term dominates the explanation. If the agent dominates, the story emphasizes character and personal responsibility. If the scene dominates, the story emphasizes circumstances and constraint. If agency dominates, the story emphasizes tools, systems, and processes. If purpose dominates, the action is interpreted through the goal it was meant to achieve. The dominant term does not merely add one more fact. It organizes the rest of the explanation around itself. That is also why two people can agree completely about what happened and still disagree about why it happened. They may not be disputing the event. They may be constructing different pentads. Here is the warning. A weak pentadic analysis simply fills in 5 boxes and stops. Act, delayed launch. Scene, workplace. Agent, manager. Agency, company systems. Purpose, protect customers. That is a description. It is not yet rhetorical analysis. The better questions are, which term receives the most attention? Which term is allowed to explain the others? What alternative agent, scene, agency, or purpose has been excluded? How would the apparent motive change if another term became dominant? The categories can also overlap. A company can function as the agent in one explanation and as part of the scene in another. A policy can function as agency because people act through it. But that same policy can also become part of the scene surrounding another action. These are not necessarily mistakes. Burke's framework is useful precisely because real explanations are messy. The pentad helps reveal where those ambiguities are doing rhetorical work. Burke later sometimes added a 6th term, attitude, creating what scholars often call a hexad. But the original 5-part pentad remains the most widely used version, and it is more than enough to begin seeing how explanations assign motive. So, how do you actually use it? Start with the communicator's language. What do they define as the act? What scene do they construct? Who becomes the agent? What agency receives attention? What purpose is named or implied? Then identify the dominant term and the strongest ratio. Does the scene excuse the act? Does the agent's character explain it? Does the purpose justify it? Does the agency make the outcome seem inevitable? Then rebuild the pentad, change the scene, expand the agent, replace the purpose, introduce an ignored agency. Ask what happens to the apparent motive when you do. The goal is not to invent random alternative explanations. It is to recognize that the original explanation was also constructed. You can use this with speeches, apologies, news stories, advertisements, political arguments, workplace explanations, and everyday conversations. Whenever someone tells you why something happened, listen for what gets treated as the cause, what gets pushed into the background, and who is being asked to carry the responsibility. Burke's pentad does not reach inside someone's mind and reveal the one true motive. It shows you how a motive is being made plausible. Act, scene, agent, agency, purpose. 5 terms. But the real meaning lives in the relationships between them. Change the scene, and the act may begin to look inevitable. Change the agent, and it may look irresponsible. Change the agency, and the system may become the cause. Change the purpose, and failure may become protection. Once you see the grammar behind an explanation, you can finally ask not only why someone acted, but why the story of their motive was told that way.